it's important to make peace with discomfort. There's something perverse about expecting always to be comfortable. Life is messy. Sometimes discomfort opens us up to growth and to knowledge and to meaning. And it's especially relevant today in America, in a country with deep political divisions. I think it's impossible to engage honestly without some discomfort. What that principal in Connecticut was doing that day with my brother in law is that he was choosing comfort over truth. Because to acknowledge the truth, which is that my nephew, of course, was different, would be to ask why all the kids do something and one child is singled out over and over, and that child happens to be the black child. Acknowledging it would also mean having to ask, does the fact that the teachers are nothing like him have anything to do with his being singled out over and over again? Of course, teachers who do not look like you can be wonderful for you. But the truth is that teachers are human beings who bring to their jobs, as we all do, the totality of their own particular experience. And teachers naturally come to expect what they themselves experienced. And it leads to an expectation from teachers that the child's family must do things a particular way. But things that are important to a teacher might not necessarily be important to a child's family. If a child's family doesn't experience school as a teacher did, then that teacher is likely to judge the family. So if a teacher grew up with parents who diligently signed those forms that you get in a nice folder in your backpack, and the child doesn't, that teacher is likely to feel a certain kind of way about it. I want to tell a story about a woman I met in a bookstore. I'd gone in to look at children's books. I have a 3-year-old, actually almost 3-year-old. She's 3 in 2 weeks, and I'm beyond excited. But even before I had her, I would often go in to buy children's books because I have nephews and nieces, and I'm the auntie who's involved in everybody's life and who sort of gets in their business. And so I was in a bookstore talking, and there's a woman in the bookstore, and I was talking to her about how I was having a difficult time finding children's books, early children's books that had black characters. Actually, to be completely honest in the storytelling, I had first said diverse characters, and then I thought I needed to be clear, because even that can be very murky when we talk about, sometimes it's important, I think, to unpack what we mean by diverse. So I said very clearly that I wanted to find books that had black children. And because the books that didn't have, they mostly had animal characters, but the ones that didn't had white children. And she was very sympathetic, and she said, yes, I see why you would want books like that. Her emphasis was on you, as though she herself did not think this was particularly important for her. I think there's something wonderful and affirming about reading about your reality and reading what is familiar and seeing yourself reflected in fiction and in literature. And that particular pleasure should never be denied anyone. But it is equally important to read about people who are not like you. If for anything, then because the world is not full of people like you. I wished that that woman had also considered it important for herself to have children's books in which the characters are diverse, to have white children and black children and Asian children and Hispanic children and children who are different in all kinds of ways. Because if she reads diverse books to her children, then she's preparing them, hopefully, for a world in which their conception of people is wider and healthier. I like to think of myself as a lifelong student. And I do not merely want to read about people who do not look like me, but I also want to hear even people I disagree with. And so, for example, even though my politics are left-leaning, I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, which is decidedly not left-leaning. And I deliberately seek out and I want to learn how people who do not see the world as I do think, because I think it helps me better able to understand the world. The content of education matters. It's not enough to be educated. It's important also to talk about the content of our education. I think very often, for example, that until Galileo put up his telescope to look at the sky, in the great and the grand universities across Europe, students were being taught that the heavens were this sort of perfect arrangement of beautiful layers of, I don't know, gold and silver. And also in thinking about the education that happened in the colonized parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America, is to realize that education often meant teaching the so-called natives self-hate. And it is not surprising in talking to many older people in these parts of the world, in Nigeria, for example, that they often have very disturbing views of their own history. And it's a result of the education that they had. And I was recently reading about Hillary Clinton being wiped out of books in one particular state in the US. So there's also magical thinking going on. So it's not enough to have an education, the content matters, and books should have a range of people. And the reason books should have a range of people is not because we want to be politically correct, but because we want to be accurate. You cannot understand the world if you know only about a fraction of the world. In small town Connecticut, my nephew finally left that school and went to another school in so it wasn't small town, it was sort of not very small town Connecticut. And I was thinking, should I name names? But I thought this is not a good place to name names because I feel like somebody will figure out and then write, she said the people in Connecticut. Because also I think I'm only using my examples, I think, to talk about a larger, what I think is a larger phenomenon. But when my nephew moved to another school, I came to see that there's a fundamental unfairness that is embedded in the structure of American public education because of property taxes. All public education is not equal. It should be, but it's not. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because then we have to question America's claim to having a system that is purely meritocratic. I also came to understand, from observing my nephew's experience, that in America, sometimes race becomes class. Or, as a friend of mine recently put it, they see the black child and they immediately think Title I. By the way, when my friend said that, I had no idea what Title I meant, so it was sort of an opportunity for me to get an education. This friend, who actually lives here, who lives in Maryland, had problems with her child's school, and she said that they couldn't see anything past his blackness, and that there was often the automatic assumption that he had come from an economically and educationally deprived background. But both his parents, Nigerian immigrants, were physicians. And it made me think about how many black and brown children, how many poor children of any race who are seen in terms only of their need will grow up with their dignity eroded because they were not seen as full human beings, but only as a single thing, a person in need. Now, this same friend of mine, the Nigerian immigrant who's a physician, has children who I think it's fair to say are not meek or mild-mannered. And she said that her son that a teacher had said about her son, he's so rough. And I think saying he's so rough is one way of thinking about him. But then there's another way, which is he's assertive and confident. Now, I'm not suggesting that we excuse bad behavior. Bad behavior should never be excused. And actually, I have a little confession to make, which is that there's a certain informality in American schools between instructor and instructed that I'm not very keen on. Because I think it sometimes blurs the lines and enables bad behavior in students. But again, I am an African immigrant and I came from a very strict school system. The point I want to make about bad behavior is that it is important to be clear about when we are sanctioning the behavior and when we are sanctioning not so much the behavior, but the body exhibiting that behavior. And here's another story about a woman I don't know very well, but I met her at my daughter's daycare. And she told me a story about her son in daycare, so he's 3.5, 4 maybe, and he's playing with another child. Her son is black, her son's friend is white, and she dropped in to visit the class, and they're playing in the science center, and the teacher says to the white child, "Oh, that's so good, you're going to be a scientist." And then later says to her son, "Oh, that's so good, you're going to be a mechanic." And she said that she got very upset, and she spoke to the teacher about it later. And the teacher got very upset and said she hadn't meant anything bad. And at the end, both of them were in tears. And something had gone wrong there. I think both of them were sincere, but they were not hearing the same thing. It was almost as though, listening to her, in my imagination, they were inhabiting two walls that were not intersecting. How do we bridge those two walls? And we must bridge them if public education is to succeed. Maybe if the teacher saw the context of the child and his history as a black boy in a country that has systematically broken the dreams of black people, a country that has made non-black people think of black people in stereotypical ways. It takes a willingness to be uncomfortable, and it takes courage. And it's not easy, but I think it's worth it if we are to mold a generation of people who will be better and who will do better than we have. We need to broaden and widen our conception of how things are and of how things should be. A child is never a single thing. A child whose family doesn't sign all those nice forms in the folder in her backpack can also be a child who is loved and cared for. It may merely be that the child's parents don't really know how the system works. A child who fails a test can also be a very intelligent child who needs to learn in a different way. I know how many times I sat bored to death in class because I didn't feel challenged. Maybe we need to ask real questions about teachers and who becomes a teacher and who gets hired. How is the recruiting done? I was thinking recently of Maryland, which is my American home, and wondering if teachers are recruited from the historically black colleges. And if they are recruited, do people think of things like transportation? Because I think when you're a student and you're doing your student teaching in your 4th year and you don't have a car and the school is very far away, then it becomes almost impossible for you to do it. And without the student teaching experience, you're not likely to get hired in the sorts of schools where maybe your presence is needed. I think we also need to question how we define who belongs and who doesn't belong. I remember once a friend of mine saying that a teacher wasn't a good fit at her child's school. This friend, by the way, is black, and she was talking about a teacher who is also black. The teacher had an inner city accent. Now, the teacher spoke English perfectly, her grammar was fine, but apparently she had an inner city accent, and so it had been decided that she wasn't a good fit. And that made me wonder, how do we define good fit? What determines good fit? And will children benefit from hearing somebody who speaks in a way that's different? It also made me think that what was in question, her accent, was itself a consequence of structural exclusion. And public education has a moral duty and a civic duty to start to dismantle that structural exclusion. We need to remember that students are not employees and schools are not corporations. And the point of education is not to maximize profit. It is to maximize human potential. I've always kind of liked that. Okay. And I think it's also important to remember that human potential is this beautiful, gloriously messy, inchoate thing that can never have one single solution, and that there are many, many solutions. And thank you.